case number N15519-363 in the matter of the Blair-Berry children. Petition number 15001-623. Today we're here for continuing bench trial on original petition for permanent custody. Will all parties please state your name for the record?
Kelly McAfee, Assistant Attorney General on behalf of DHHS.
John Giancotti from Chap Guardian ad litem.
Adam Devlin, attorney for Alexander Dorsey.
Alexander Dorsey.
Good morning, Laura Anderson, P51285. I represent the father, Stephen Berry.
Stephen Berry.
Good morning, Your Honor. Tracy Ann Martin, P63745. I'm here starting out line for Ms. Michelle Blair, who appears today by video link from Huron Valley. Please state your full name for the record.
Michelle Blair, Matthew and Gabrielle, always will be.
Good morning, Your Honor. Janice L. Burns, 35185, counsel on behalf of Michelle Blair.
All right, everyone can have a seat. We were last here on this matter June 30th, 2015. At that point, the court took jurisdiction over the children regarding mother and both fathers. The court also found a statutory basis for termination of rights for both mother along with fathers Dorsey and Berry, and continued the matter to today's date for best interest hearing. So my understanding from our pre-conference is that we have a number of witnesses today for best interests. But before we get to that, any preliminary matters, starting with you, Ms. Megacy?
It's just that there was a sequestration order in effect for the case, and at prior proceedings, parties are all asking that that sequestration order continue. In speaking to some of the attorneys, Ms. Anthony is the foster care worker. I would submit she's a party to this case as it's indicated, but the other attorneys, or at least one, has indicated desire to have her sequestered. I leave that to the court.
Okay, so in the courtroom right now, we have Ms. Anthony and we also have Dr. Henry, correct?
Yes, you're
Any
right.
other potential witnesses?
All other potential witnesses have been sequestered.
Okay. Mr. Giancotti, any preliminary matters and or statement regarding the sequestration?
Nothing at this time. I may have some other statements when other witnesses are called.
Mr. Devlin? And Ms. Anderson?
Yes, Your Honor. The court had previously sequestered the foster care worker, and I ask that that continue.
And the court will know before I get to Ms. Burns is essentially the petitioner is here and she's allowed to stay. She's protective services. The foster care worker is not the petitioner, and so pursuant to the sequestration order, the court will have her sequestered until we get to her testimony. So if you wait outside, we'll call you when we get to your testimony. Ms. Burns, any preliminary matters?
I have none, Your Honor. Thank you.
Okay. Then Ms. Megacy, we'll start with your first witness.
I would call Dr. Henry to the stand.
Dr. Henry, would you come forward so you can be sworn in?
Do you swear or affirm that the testimony that you're about to give us the truth?
I do.
And please state and spell your name for the record.
James Henry, James Henry.
All right, Dr. Henry, you can have a seat here. Thank you. Ms. Megacy?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Dr. Henry, what do you do for a living?
I'm a professor at Western Michigan University, and I'm also the director of the Southwest Michigan Children's Trauma Assessment Center, which is under the umbrella of Western Michigan University.
The Children's Trauma Center?
Yes.
And what is the purpose of the Children's Trauma Center?
The purpose of the Children's Trauma Center is to do neurodevelopmental trauma assessments of children who've experienced maltreatment and to understand the impact of that maltreatment.
And how do you do neurodevelopment assessments?
We have a team of pediatrician, a speech and language professor, occupational therapy professor, a social worker, myself, and several clinicians who do a transdisciplinary model of assessment, and at other times we do a abbreviated trauma assessment. So we look at the impact of trauma to learning, to relationships, to behavior, to total functioning.
And how long have you been the director of this center?
We started this center in 2000, and I have been the director since co-founding that center in 2000.
That was my next question. You were a co-founder of this center?
Yes.
Prior to being the director and co-founder of this center, what did you do for a living?
I came to Western Michigan University as a professor in School of Social Work in 1997, And prior to that, I had spent 17 years doing child protective services as a worker and a supervisor.
Can you briefly describe your educational background?
I have a bachelor's degree in elementary education from Western Michigan University. I have a master's degree in social work from Western Michigan University. I have a postgraduate fellowship on child abuse from the University of Michigan, and I have a PhD from Michigan State in social work and developmental psychology.
Have you ever testified in a court proceeding before of this nature?
Innumerable times, yes.
Okay. Have you testified in best interest hearings?
Many times, yes.
Okay. In this courthouse?
No.
In what other courthouses?
I've testified in Washtenaw County. I've testified many, many times in Cass County, St. Joseph County, Kalamazoo County, Berrien County, Van Buren County, Allegan County, and probably 2 or 3 more.
And have you evaluated children and parents in terms of best interest hearings?
Yes.
And the purpose was to provide a recommendation to the court in terms of termination of parental rights.
That is correct.
Have you been declared an expert in any of these courts before?
In each one of those courts, yes.
And what have you been deemed an expert in?
Child maltreatment, child trauma, child sexual abuse, child development, domestic violence.
And you actually tendered me, or gave me, or someone from your staff gave me a copy of your CV, or curriculum vitae, is that correct?
That's correct.
And, Your Honor, I have what's been marked as DH as proposed exhibit number 1, which is composed of 5 different pages. It is Dr. Henry's CV or curriculum vitae. This has been provided to the attorneys. I move for its admission at this time.
All right, any objections to that?
None, Your Honor.
None, Your Honor. None, Your Honor.
All
May I
right.
approach?
Yes, it'll be admitted. Thank you.
Your Honor, subject to any further voir dire from the attorneys, I would move to qualify Dr. Henry as an expert in child maltreatment, trauma, and development at this point.
No objections, Your Honor.
Anyone else have an objection?
None, Your Honor.
All right, so you're asking for him to be qualified as an expert in child maltreatment, trauma,
And development.
and development. Okay, Dr. Henry will be so qualified without objection.
Dr. Henry, regarding this case, the children, Matthew Berry and Gabrielle Blair, are you familiar with those children?
Yes.
How are you familiar with those children?
We did an assessment of Gabrielle, and we refer to her as Gabby. So we did an assessment of Gabby on April the 8th, 2015. On that same day, my colleague and I did an evaluation of Matthew, or Maddie, on 4/8 as well.
Okay. And when you say, you initially started by saying we did an assessment, who is we?
Myself and my colleague Amy Perricone, who's in the audience now.
And Amy Perry, is it Perricone?
Perricone. Perricone, yes.
Okay. And what is her role at the trauma center?
She is a clinician at the trauma center.
And a clinician's role or responsibility at the center is to do what?
Is to participate in the assessment and the testing and the compilation of the report.
And in addition to these children, Gabby and Maddie, or Matthew, did you also conduct evaluations of Alexander Dorsey, Stephen Berry, the father, and Michelle Blair?
Yes, and, excuse me, and those occurred on 7/9/2015.
And was that with Ms. Perricone present also?
Yes.
So for all of those evaluations, 5 evaluations, Ms. Perricone was present?
Yes.
Okay. What was your purpose in conducting the assessment of the children?
The purpose was to understand the potential impact of the maltreatment and exposure to the death of the 2 siblings of Matthew and Gabby.
And how is it that that was done?
That was done in Detroit to reduce the stress of coming to Kalamazoo. And so we did that assessment at Kids Talk, where we met with initially Gabby for a period of about 2.5 hours, and then Following that, met with Matthew, and we did testing and a psychosocial interview of the children. Prior to that, there was a history taken from the great aunt, Angela, and to contextualize their behaviors prior to coming to see us for the evaluation.
So prior to speaking to either child, you spoke with the great aunt, Angela, is that correct?
That's correct, and we also spoke with the caseworker, the Child Protective Services worker, at least 2 or 3 times, again, to get a history. That's part of our assessment process, to get a history prior to the kids coming.
Okay, and when you say the caseworker, that would be Ms. Hayden?
Yes.
Hayden? Okay. And did you speak with Gabby or Maddie first?
Gabby.
And you stated you did, there was testing involved?
Yes.
Is that correct, with both children?
Yes.
Same test conducted with both children?
Yes.
Okay, can you explain what tests were?
Yes, we initially performed what's called a Kaufman Brief Intelligence Test to look at her verbal and nonverbal intelligence. And so we completed that. We completed what's called the VMI, which is a visual motor inventory, and that looks at her capacity to integrate what she sees and being able to put that on paper. We did what's called the SELF, which is a language screener, looking at expressive and receptive language. We did an executive functioning questionnaire with Gabby as well, and we also did what's called pragmatics, which is looking at a child's ability to communicate in terms of reciprocal conversation, in being able to provide a narrative, and also to be able to understand the intentions of others when communicating. Those were the testings that we did with Gabby, and we also did the same with Maddie, although the baseline was different, obviously, because their ages were different.
And when you say the executive functioning questionnaire, what is the purpose of that questionnaire?
The purpose of that questionnaire is, it's a self-report that we did with Gabby, and we did not do that with Matthew. We just did that with Gabby, all right? And it is a way to look at how the prefrontal cortex part of the brain, which is the thinking center, how they process information, how they're able to problem solve, how they're able to regulate their own emotions, and how they're able to be aware of what they're communicating. So it's a very significant process that kids and adults as well need in order to be able to problem solve.
And you stated this test was not done with Maddie or Matthew. Why is it that this test was not done with
Because he was too young.
Is there an age requirement?
I believe it's 8 or 9, I can't say exactly, but we did not do that with him.
And why are all of these tests performed?
Well, one of the things that we know about potentially exposure to trauma, and I say trauma just so we're all on the same page, is trauma is an overwhelming event that renders a child or an adult helpless, powerless, and it continues to impact their functioning after the event is over. So even though the event is over, their perception of the world has been changed, usually to perceive danger most everywhere, and there's an ongoing fragmentation of thought that occurs in children who've experienced trauma, and in other words, having difficulty organizing their memories. And so that's what I mean by trauma. So these tests, one of the things research has demonstrated over and over again in the last 10 years, and our center has written one of those papers, is that chronic exposure to traumatic stress can affect learning, can affect the neurodevelopmental progress of children. And so our center looks at that because we believe that it's critical to understand potential neurodevelopmental impact following chronic exposure to trauma.
With respect to the testing component of your evaluation with Gabby, were there any of the tests that caused you concern? Or the results
Gabby,
from the
yeah. One of the very positive things about the findings for Gabby was that her IQ was in the normal range, and given her ongoing exposure to traumatic stress, That is definitely a strength of hers. She hadn't been to school for an extended period of time, and so the fact that her IQ is in the normal range, I believe it was 93, a composite, or 94, is a significant resiliency factor for her future. The other testing varied, but it was all still within the continuum of average. And so there was a positive findings for each of the tests for Gabby.
In terms of the evaluations of the children, you stated that the testing was a component of your evaluation, and what were the other components of this evaluation?
Was the psychosocial interview of both Gabby and Matthew.
And what happens during the psychosocial interview?
During the psychosocial interview, we probe to understand what the child's perception of his or her world is, in order to be able to understand what the impact of that trauma can be to their functioning. And so we ask questions about how they have experienced the events. So we are not detailing the events. This is not a forensic interview. It's a way to understand the impact. And so we ask questions that we've developed over the last 15 years to be able to help us understand that process.
And that was done with both children, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay. And are conclusions made or opinions made as a result of this psychosocial interview?
Yes, they're a very critical component of the entire assessment, and it fits in to be able to identify what the child has been doing as a way to cope with what has happened to them.
And what were the conclusions as a result of this psychosocial interview with Gabby?
It became very evident that what Gabby had done was internalize the traumatic stress that she had experienced continually. And I'll just kind of narrate that for a second if I can. One of the things that was very clear was her experience of terror in her home because she never knew what was going to happen. And so she had become the caretaker and, quote, parent for Matthew. And so her number one responsibility was to make sure Matthew was safe. And so there were innumerable times when she felt he potentially could be in danger. She described many times standing at the bottom of the steps when the mother would call Maddie upstairs and not knowing if he was going to come down alive or hurt. And she said there were periods of time when she didn't breathe, literally because of that terror. So it became clear that she was living in a constant terror, which then affected her ability to function in a way that was healthy. But what she did do is she internalized all her stress so that she did not demonstrate behaviors that were challenging. Just the opposite. She placated the mother as a way to try and keep keep Matthew safe and herself. Her brain, in a normal process, when somebody's continually exposed to traumatic stress, dissociates. So she described it, I just became numb. I couldn't feel anything. And in that numbness, there is a self-protection because it is too scary to be in her body. And so she dissociated continually.
When you say dissociated from what?
Dissociated from reality. Basically, in dissociation, your brain separates from your body, and you're watching your body. It's a self-protective mechanism that the brain does when it is under extreme stress or terror in order to be able to survive. And so she did this continually in this process. She also felt responsible for the death of her siblings, saying that I should have protected them and continued to live with this after their deaths, and feel responsible that she had not protected them. And then had this overwhelming sense of guilt, remorse, and also, as she described herself, this perpetual anger inside of her that she controlled and was always very fearful that this was going to explode, and if it did, she was so aware of what it might incur, meaning harm to her, or most importantly for her, was harm to Maddie. So she lived in this constant threat, this constant terror, and the brain developed coping strategies, and she at points said, I felt like I was going crazy, or that I am crazy. And part of our assessment and part of that interaction was to help her to understand that she wasn't going crazy, but rather that she had been traumatized, that what had happened to her had then caused her reactions that made her feel so different, so numb, and so responsible for everything that happened. The last part of this is that at times she would have intrusive thoughts, meaning thoughts that would come in of fragments of the past maltreatment, physical, both to herself in terms of being burned and hit, as well as the death of her siblings. And she employed what's called avoidance. So when they happened, she would try to just distract herself so as to not be able to think them and to be overwhelmed, which is a very common reaction, so that these would come back to her periodically, and her coping mechanism was that avoidance.
And did she explain how she would distract or engage in avoidance?
Just in terms of reading was the primary way. She would try to read, and as she said to me, reading was a way for me to escape my world. And I think it's very significant that she was a continuous reader, because that was that distraction and that escape. Recently she said in an interview that we had that she's been surprised because she hasn't read nearly as much anymore. And so it's not that she's not reading, but not in a way to distract herself. And I thought that was a significant statement given what she had done to survive in the environment within her home.
And when you say recently she's told you she hasn't been reading as much, when was the last time you saw her? We saw her on 7/9 when we did the observations with the parents, the fathers I should say, and I saw her last night. And what was the purpose in seeing her last night?
Purpose was there had been a subpoena, and the purpose was to kind of help her understand what it would be to testify in court today. And so what is often done and very helpful for children is to kind of give them some predictability if they testify what's going to happen. And so it was to give an overview of the court process to her.
In your evaluation of both children, you prepared a report after your evaluation was completed, correct?
That's correct.
And part of this report, it goes through the steps that you've already described, the testing in each test that was done, correct?
Yes.
And what the results of those tests were for each child,
Yes.
correct? This report also discusses your psychosocial interview, correct?
Yes.
After the psychosocial interview portion of your report, however, there's a trauma exposure and system measure portion. Is that correct?
Yes.
What is that?
That's a checklist that our trauma center has developed that's being used across Michigan and other places in the country that looks at potential trauma exposures that the child may have experienced. Gabby has what's called complex trauma, and complex trauma is a phenomena where you're continuously exposed to multiple potential traumatic events within your family. And so this checklist is a way to understand how many potential different types of events could have occurred, and then behaviors, mood, school functioning, and relationally how that may be manifested. It's not a clinical tool, it's a screen to kind of understand the connections between potential traumatic events and behaviors and mood.
In terms of Gabby's coping mechanisms with the trauma in her life, you talked about avoidance. Is that a coping mechanism? Or
Yes.
Is that something?
Yes.
Okay. Was there also, your report discusses her role with her brother.
Yes.
Was that also a coping mechanism for her? Or how would you describe her role with her brother?
Gabby was clearly Matthew's parent from the time he was born. She described changing his diapers, getting him at night, feeding him, and so she served as the primary parent for Matthew. And that bond, that relational bond, provided Gabby with a sense of importance and meaning to survive. So in a sense, his needs became more important than hers, and that's what really helped her to continue to go forward, because of the relationship that she established from birth, I believe, with Maddie. And so that was a survival, that was a coping, and yet that was also a resiliency factor, because it gave her a connection to her brother that was vital for her to continue to function.
And we haven't gotten into Maddie or Matthew's assessment yet, but you said that this connection was vital to Gabby. Do you evaluated Maddie also? Do you
Yes.
view this connection as being vital to him also?
Absolutely. We have to realize that both children lived in terror, and when terror occurs, it strengthens a bond between people who are trying to survive. That's kind of known as the Stockholm syndrome. It's known as other things, but in that connection, that this bond develops so strongly because it's not normal everyday stress. It is terror, and terror makes an emotional connection that now both of them in their survival need each other.
Need each other in what way?
Need each other to survive, right? That they became necessary as one, two coming together. Maddie's dependence on Gabby is extreme, that he sees her as keeping her alive, and so
Keeping her alive or him
keeping him alive, and so that dependence that he has is what's been able to help him manage his own trauma.
In terms of the initial assessment that was done with Gabby, was there any information gleaned from either the aunt or from Gabby herself regarding Gabby's father, Alexander Dorsey?
There was some. It was minimal, in the sense that there was minimal contact. There was a kind of a dad-father being in and out, and as Maddie said, there were as Gabby said, there were times when the mother would have Gabby call her father to bring food to the house, that they didn't have any. And so that contact was very sporadic and periodic, basically very limited as she described it.
In this report, which, Your Honor, I would just indicate for the record that there are 5 reports that were generated by Dr. Henry. One, an initial assessment that was done with Gabby, an initial assessment that was done with Matthew. There are also 3 reports, one pertaining to Michelle Blair, Alexander Dorsey, and Stephen Berry, that those have been supplied to the court, and the attorneys have been supplied their respective client's report along with the child that pertains to the respective client. Those reports, obviously Michelle Blair's attorney was supplied both children's assessments or evaluations. I ask the court to take judicial notice of those reports at this time. They've never been admitted formally, so I move for their admission and the court to take judicial notice of those reports.
And Mr. Giancotti has all 5 reports?
Yes.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, so starting with you, Mr. Giancotti, any objections?
None.
Mr. Devlin?
No, Your Honor.
Ms. Anderson?
No.
And Mrs. Burns?
None, Your Honor.
Okay, so all 5 reports will be admitted, but we need to have them marked accordingly, Ms. Megacy. So let's go off the record for a moment. We'll take a brief recess. You can just remain there, Dr. Henry, for just a second while we mark these.
Now GHS exhibit number 2, which is Gabby's evaluation or assessment. In your report, you have a section labeled recommendations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And the recommendations with respect to Gabby after this evaluation, there's actually 11 different recommendations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you summarize what those recommendations were after your initial evaluation assessment of Gabby?
Yes, generally, A, that Gabby should remain at the great aunt's home, Two is that...
Well, let me stop you there. When you say that Gabby should remain at the great aunt's home, is that correct?
Yes.
Why is that your recommendation, or was that your recommendation at that point?
A, she felt very safe there. B, Angela, the great aunt, was very committed to her well-being. And C, she needs stability, permanency, and safety in order to be able to heal and recover. And it was clear just in the time that Gabby had spent at Angela's that she was receiving that from her aunt and her uncle.
The uncle being a person who was married to Angela, is
Yes.
that correct? So that was the first recommendation. What was the second recommendation?
The second was treatment for Gabby, trauma treatment, that it is absolutely essential that she have trauma treatment and receive the support necessary to process her experiences in order to be able to recover and to move forward in her life and to be successful.
The third recommendation?
The third was termination of the father's rights. Information from Gabby from the case file that we had gotten from the Department of Human Services, information from Angela, who had some history of the family, and most importantly, Gabby's own understanding. Her own report indicated minimal to no contact or for periods of time. And so that was the other primary recommendation. There are other recommendations that are very specific to needs, but those three are the primary driving forces that should happen at this point.
In terms of the recommendation of termination of parental rights, you addressed a recommendation concerning both Michelle Blair and Stephen Barry's rights, is that correct?
That's correct.
And was that recommendation termination of both of their rights?
Yes.
And why is that?
Your Honor, I would object. I believe that the line of questioning has been regarding Mr. Dorsey at this point, unless counsel switched to Mr. Barry.
I'm sorry, Mr. Barry. I'm sorry, Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you.
Correct. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Anderson. In terms of Gabby, thank you.
Yes.
Her father being Alexander Dorsey and mother being Michelle Blair, your recommendation was termination of both of their rights. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And why did you have that recommendation?
A is that obviously Gabby had experienced significant abuse herself by the living with her mother and from her mother, which certainly would make that abuse her unfit to live and to terminate parental rights. So that would be A for mom. B for dad, that I, in giving that history and understanding that the father had neglected his duty to his daughter and his daughter who had been killed, and that therefore this potentially could have been avoided had he taken an active role in the care and well-being of his children. And I felt that given the length of time and the only periodic contact, which was minimal, that termination was appropriate.
You also, part of your recommendations included that Gabby remain with Maddie, is that correct?
Absolutely.
And is that for the reasons you've already stated on the record?
Yes.
In terms of Gabby and therapy and making progress based upon what's happened in the past to her, do you have an opinion regarding the type of figure she needs in her life in terms of an adult or a parental figure?
Yes, she needs someone, as I said earlier, that is stable, secure, supportive, provides predictability. So those are essential for her in terms of her development and her ability to recover. And with that kind of support and with that kind of therapeutic support to process the trauma, then I strongly believe that her trajectory is very positive and it is certainly in her best interest to remain there.
And do you have an opinion as to where it is in Gabby's best interest to remain?
At Angela's home, her great aunts.
Staying with Gabby now, moving on to her mother and father, Michelle Blair. You conducted assessments or evaluations of both parents, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And who did you speak with first?
I spoke with her father, Alexander Dorsey.
But you spoke with or interviewed both parents on the same day, is that correct?
That is correct.
And what day was that?
That was July 9th, 2015.
Where did you speak to Mr. Dorsey at?
At Kids Talk on Southgate, in Southgate.
And can you explain what the process was in terms of your assessment of Mr. Dorsey?
Yes. Initially, we sat down with Gabby and just asked her questions about her father to kind of understand what she was feeling at the moment, what she was feeling about her dad. There had been some concern because she hadn't seen her dad in at least a month, I think, give or take a week, and so that she had not been visiting her dad because she didn't want to see him. And so...
Let me stop you there. Was that confirmed by Gabby that
Yes.
his visits had stopped because she did not desire to see him?
Yes.
She was present for this evaluation on the 9th?
Yes.
Did Gabby explain to you on the 9th why she had not wanted to see her father?
Yes.
What was her reasoning?
Her reasoning was that the girlfriend of Mr. Dorsey had testified at a hearing, and Gabby had read it online, that there were times that Mr. Dorsey would bring food and diapers and other supplies to the home for the children when she was living with her mother. And Gabby was very upset, stating that diapers had never been provided to her or her family, that yes, Mr. Dorsey had brought food on occasion, but had never brought those diapers to the family. So she was very angry, and so had been refusing to see Mr. Dorsey.
So this evaluation with respect to Mr. Dorsey, do you speak with Gabby first or do you speak with Mr. Dorsey first on the 9th?
On the 9th, I spoke with Gabby first.
And the information you gleaned from Gabby was what?
Just as I shared, as well as I asked her if she'd be willing to do the visit, because she hadn't, and she had resisted, and she said yes. And I said, would you like us in the room, meaning myself and or my colleague Amy, in the room with her, or we could do a video stream where she could go in a room with her dad and I could watch it in another room. And she requested that we sit in the room during that visit, which we did.
Who's we?
Myself and at times Amy. I was in there the whole time. Mrs. Barricone was in there on and off because she had something else she was doing.
So per Gabby's request, she would only do the visit with her father if you were present?
Yes.
Did she explain why?
Just because she was so angry, she was uncomfortable, and that is why.
Prior to going into this room with Gabby and her father, did you speak to Mr. Dorsey?
Yes.
Did you explain to him what your purpose of being there was?
Yes.
What did you explain to him?
I explained that we were going to A, observe him with Gabby, and B, that I was going to interview him after the interview to talk about his perceptions of his history with Gabby and the family. And we would do that after we did what's called the MIM. It's called the Marshak Inventory Method, which is a series of activities, I believe 4 or 5 of them, where you give the parent an activity to do with the child. And so I explained those. I gave those to him. He had those in his hand prior to entering the room with Gabby.
The visit with the father, with Mr. Dorsey and Gabby, how long was that visit supposed to be?
There was no time frame. We hadn't defined it in terms of a time frame as to an hour, or I had not put a time limit on that.
Was your observation of the interaction between the two, however, minimized or lessened as a result of anything?
I'm not sure your question, ma'am.
It appears in your reports that the interaction was not an hour but 45 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes.
Was there a reason for that?
Well, basically the interaction, if I could just explain that, that would get to the answer to your question. Is that okay?
Sure.
All right. So the interaction was very uncomfortable in the sense that Mr. Dorsey was very quiet. He did engage in eye contact with Gabby. Gabby had minimal eye contact with him. She obviously was very nervous, and so there was a lot of small talk going back and forth. And so that was very evident of her anxiety. And so what happened is that I was waiting for Mr. Dorsey to lead the activities that he had, and so I had told Gabby that there were activities. I did show her the activities, but I told her that he was going to do some activities with her prior to this interaction happening. And so what happened at that point is Gabby basically said, "Let me see the activities," and so he showed her the activities, and she led the activities. In other words, she said the first one was basically, "Tell me a time when you were young," a story about when you were young, meaning when Gabby was young. And so Gabby took that and started telling a story about when she was young to kind of engage Mr. Dorsey in the process.
Okay, so this is part of the Marsha, is that what is that what you described?
Yeah.
There were 5 different activities?
Yes.
One of them was telling a story about when you were younger?
Yes.
Or the father telling a story, in this case Mr. Dorsey, about when Gabby was younger,
Yes.
is that correct?
Correct.
And you explained to him that that was something you wanted him to do?
Yes.
And was he able to do that?
No, that was led by Gabby.
What were some of the other activities?
I can list them. They're here in the report if I could just take a peek.
Would that refresh your memory?
Yes.
Then please do so.
So, just play a familiar game with the child, teach the child something the child does not know, and thumb wrestling. And those activities are to look at 4 components of parenting: engagement, nurturing, structure, and challenge. And so those activities help produce those interactions that look at those 4 components.
Did Mr. Dorsey himself initiate any of these activities?
I do not believe he initiated any. I could be wrong. He may have initiated one of them.
Is that concerning to you?
Yes, I think that and it describes in the report as Mr. Dorsey being passive. He certainly, like I said, had eye contact, would respond to her statements, but it was clear that in that relationship that it was Gabby who was leading the conversation and directing the interaction.
And what does that tell you?
Well,
in terms of Mr. Dorsey and his ability to parent, if anything?
It certainly says that Mr. Dorsey would be much more of a passive parent, which was confirmed by his own indication in interaction with me when he talked about that he had a kind of a backseat role in relation to the children, and at one point defined himself as non-confrontational, meaning that he doesn't like confrontation, and so that was one of the reasons why he didn't pursue finding out what had happened to his daughter, Stoney, because he didn't want to confront the mom because of her anger and her outbursts. And so it was clear that in the relationship that I saw, in just that interaction, that Gabby went to her norm of being the parent and leading and directing, and she did that, and he responded to her in a way that was certainly not rude, not disrespectful, responsive, but not an expectation of what you would want in your parent to respond to the needs of your child who had been so traumatized.
Did there appear to be any type of bond between Gabby and her father during this interaction?
Prior to the observation in my interview with Gabby, she indicated that she views her father just as another human being, that she does not feel close to him, she does not feel quote, love for him in the sense of father to daughter or daughter to father, but rather that he was another person in her life but not someone that she had a relationship with.
Did Gabby indicate whether she wanted to have a relationship with him in the future?
She indicated at this point she was not interested in that she did not want that relationship at the current time.
How did the portion of this assessment where the two are interacting, Gabby and her father, how was it that that ended?
I ended the interaction. I thought that the activities have been performed. There was some kind of prolonged silences where you could see they weren't sure what to talk about. And given Gabby's history of not having seen her dad in a month, having anxiety already, that I felt it was in Gabby's best interest to stop the visit, because I did not see an interaction that was engaging or nurturing that was going to be beneficial to her.
And this was after how long?
This is about approximately 40 minutes. Your Honor, would you be all right if we shut that door? It's very difficult for me to...
Was it, in terms of this, we said approximately 40-minute interaction? Did I get that time right?
Yes.
Okay. Did you speak to Gabby or Mr. Alexander about prior visits and how they were in relation to this current visit on the 9th?
As I understood it, after the visit, I spoke with Mr. Dorsey, interviewed him, and I also spoke with Gabby, and both of them indicated that this was a typical visit that they had had since she was placed in her aunt's custody.
So after this session of watching the two interact and performing these Marshak activities, you then spoke with Mr. Dorsey?
Yes.
Okay. And what did you speak to Mr. Dorsey about?
I spoke to Mr. Dorsey about how he understood Gabby, what he thought the impact could have been to her from what she experienced. I spoke to him specifically about what he was experiencing himself, given the information that he had learned and his interactions with Gabby. I spoke to him about what he hoped for Gabby in the future. I spoke to him about a little bit about his childhood. He defined as being fine and okay. And I spoke to him about his recollection of frequency of contact with Gabby during the time when Gabby was living in the house.
In terms of the conversation, the part of the conversation that dealt with how Mr. Dorsey understood Gabby and the impact of past events on her, what were his statements, if any?
He recognized the tremendous sadness, and he called it numbing, that he was experiencing himself, given everything that happened. I thought he was very honest about that and feeling overwhelmed. He indicated that he couldn't imagine kind of what might be happening for Gabby at this point, other than he knew what he was experiencing and being overwhelmed, and really couldn't define, although he certainly could compare it to something of what he was going through.
So he indicated that he himself was overwhelmed at this point?
Yes.
Did he elaborate as to what that meant, or?
Basically, the death of his daughter, Stoney, the harm that had come to Gabby, the, quote, media coverage that felt like he couldn't get out of his house, that people always were asking about it, and that he just basically was disengaging and shutting down because it was too overwhelming.
In terms of the Gabby and the impact past events had had on her, did you speak to him or question him as to why he was sporadic in terms of his involvement in her life?
He basically gave me kind of a continuum of answer in terms of, one, as I said earlier, when talking about not questioning about what was happening to Stoney and to find out about her, he indicated that he, again, was non-confrontational and didn't want to upset the mother, all right? And the second part of that, in terms of his periodic contact with Gabby, he did not go into that at any length in terms of the reasons, other than he would see her somewhat regularly for a time and then irregularly for a time.
In terms of not wanting to be confrontational, however, did Mr. Dorsey make any statements regarding whether he knew Michelle Blair to be a violent or aggressive person in the past?
Yes, he did.
What did he state?
He said that she could be violent and aggressive.
Was that the reason he did not want to confront her?
That's what he communicated to me.
In your report, which has been admitted now as DHHS Exhibit Number 5, you also indicate during your interview with Mr. Dorsey that he described Ms. Blair as being unpredictable. Is that correct?
Yes.
Part of your report, after your interview with Mr. Dorsey, it contains a summary of the MIM observation. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's the Marshak.
Yes.
Is that what you were talking about?
Yes.
The summary, if you could explain to us what your summary of the observation was.
Well, basically that there was minimal engagement between the two, that father, as I said, had been passive, that there was not a nurturing relational interaction. Certainly there had not been a structure to it other than what Gabby had defined, and so I was very concerned about the interactions as far as seeing engagement, nurturing, and structure.
And in fact, in your report on page 5, you stated that Father Dorsey lacks the skills necessary to provide the structure and appropriate challenges necessary for her continued growth. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In terms of your report, this conclusion or summary of the MIM observation, following that is a section that's entitled Impressions. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What is this section?
This is taking all the information that I had available and framing conclusions in terms of what I saw, what I think would be in Gabby's best interest. And so I wanted to frame the information to draw those conclusions.
And in that section, under Impressions, you indicate that the observations between Gabby and her father was consistent with the history of an absent parent who lacked an understanding of his daughter's needs and strengths. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then you follow through this as you did with the assessment portion, or in the assessment of Gabby, her report, you follow through with this, with a recommendation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and that recommendation does once again deal with the termination of parental rights. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that concerning Mr. Dorsey's rights and Gabby. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in that conclusion, did you have a recommendation regarding whether Gabby's rights, her father's rights to her should be terminated?
Yes.
And what was that recommendation? What did you state?
I stated that because Gabby was 18 years old, that I did not see the potential value or even the legal ability to terminate, all right?
Is it fair to say you did not know that rights could still be terminated once Gabby achieved the age of 18?
Yes, I did not know that.
Knowing that Mr. Dorsey's rights and Michelle Blair's rights to Gabby can be terminated even though she's now a legal adult, do you believe that termination is in her best interest?
Yes.
And why is that?
Because at this point, there's a long history of what I would define as parental neglect of Gabby, and that she needs to be in a permanent, stable environment, as I said earlier. And so it is in her best interest that she remain with the aunt, and that if she was to be moved, it would be, I think, extremely traumatic to be placed with her father, given her relationship with him, and certainly her anxiety and anger, given that relationship has never been a parent-child relationship.
I want to move on to Matthew, and we'll come back to Michelle Blair collectively with both children, okay? Moving on to Matthew's assessment, again, that was done in April, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
April the 8th.
April 8th, 2015, and that was with you and Ms. Parapone, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, was that also done at Kids Talk?
Yes.
And that his assessment was composed again of the testing?
Yes.
correct? And then the psychosocial interview?
Yes.
And then getting a history from the aunt?
Yes.
Is that accurate?
Yes.
In terms of the testing and Matthew, were there any results that were concerning to you?
Yes.
What were the results?
There were many results that were concerning.
Please explain.
And as I described, the brief intelligence test that we had given to Gabby Matthews, he scored a verbal of 58, which is in the 0.3 percentile, means that 99.7% of all kids his age have a higher verbal IQ at that point than he did, all right? Which is basically would be defined in terms of developmentally disabled at that point and would receive cognitive impairment classification in the school system. His nonverbal was 74, which was at the 4th percentile, meaning 96% of kids his age would have a higher nonverbal capacity, that ability to integrate information as far as conceptually without language. So those were very concerning at that point in time. And then in the self, which is the language, the passing criteria was 17 score. He only had an 8, which was well below criterion and indicated significant language deficits. The barrier, or the VMI, was more positive. That was in the 34th percentile, indicating that he was able to take something he sees and to transmit it into the paper. All right.
Let's just pause for 1 second, Dr. Henry. See if the mother is apparently they're interrupting the mother for a moment.
Okay, I was just wondering, they want to know the status of their case.
Ms. Blair, are you able to continue?
Yes.
All right, let's go back on the record. Ms. Miggs?
You were, the last test, that, just so we're clear, that you said 34th percentile.
Right.
With respect to what result?
The BMI, which was the visual motor, so that was much more within the normal range. But the first two were very concerning.
You had information that Matthew had not been in school, is that
That's correct.
In terms of those results and the percentages and cognitive impairment, did you have an opinion regarding whether Matthew his percentiles could increase?
It was our expectation that they would increase if he was environmentally and developmentally stimulated, and so that was our hope. 54 is extremely low, and so definitely was hoping that given that kind of safety, because again, we can't learn if we're not safe. Matthew has what's called hypervigilance. He's constantly scanning his environment for danger, and so that interrupts the brain's upper, quote, prefrontal cortex ability to learn, because he's in this bottom part of his brain that's so aware of potential danger. So our hope was that as he felt safe and could begin to relax, then you can access your higher thinking. And that was the hope, given that he could access it with developmental stimulation.
In terms of Matthew or Maddie's ability to feel safe and relaxed, you've already testified about his relationship briefly with Gabby, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, do you believe that Gabby is a component in his ability to feel safe and relaxed?
She's the essence of whatever safety he has had in the past. And so she's linked, connected to his brain to say when she's there, he gives her safety. And when I say safety, given what he had experienced previously in his home with his mother and the fear and the terror that was there, that is a a safety that wasn't able to provide the necessary security, but it was enough safety in order for him to survive. And so she is inextricably linked to his safety.
In terms of the, is that a summary of the test and the results that were conducted with Matthew?
Yes.
Okay. Moving on then to the psychosocial interview portion of this assessment, can you explain what the conclusions and or observations were with Maddie?
Yes. Maddie has learned, he has a very charming smile. He has a radiant smile that is kind of plastered on his face, and we know from kids who've been traumatized that they often learn to smile as a way to keep safe, and he has this what we call superficial charm. And so he takes this wherever he goes. He walked into the assessment with this huge smile. He kept that smile. In the psychosocial interview, when we began to probe, and obviously that probing is different for his age versus as it was with Gabby, and so we did a lot of kind of play work and asking some questions and drawing on the board to kind of help him communicate. What was clear is that he's very much into avoidance, and avoidance is very consistent with his diagnosis that we gave of PTSD, that he's overwhelmed by his memories, and he has fragmented memories, as I talked about with Gabby, that they're little pieces, but they don't all make a whole, meaning a whole organized story that with which to understand what's happened to him. And so he becomes very active, which is the other part of his trauma, what we would call that hypervigilance or hyperarousal. He's a great bouncer in the sense of going from one thing to another tangentially, because he's always in this very much on the edge of fight-flight because of his experiences and how his brain has become wired. So, and he also, when he talked about, you know, that some bad things happened, my mom went to jail, I was scared, I can't talk about them, and kind of stopped at that point, and we did not push him, certainly didn't want to exacerbate that stress that he was already experiencing, but it was clear, and part of that assessment with younger kids is you're looking at the themes that come in the interaction, and certainly those themes of hypervigilance, hyperarousal, and avoidance, and fragmentation of memory were all there.
Given these conclusions regarding Maddie, do you have an opinion regarding the type of parental figure he needs in his life?
Well, since he is so young, his brain is not fully developed, and so he is at a crossroad, and I can't underline this enough, he's at a crossroad in his development, given that his development has significantly suffered cognitively because of living in this lower part of his brain, and so what he needs is predictability, ongoing security. He needs to hear and know that he's loved and cared for. He needs consistency, so that his world becomes safer when he knows day to day what's going to happen. And so all those are essential for him. He needs, at this point, continued, I believe, contact on a day-to-day basis with his sister, as he transitions from her to the caregiver in terms of who is parenting him, because obviously Gabby in the future will leave and can't remain there until he's 18. So there's a transitional time where her kind of passing along that parenting to the caregiver, in this case it's the aunt, is essential to help him build that safety. I think the relationship with his uncle has been very important to him in terms of that male relationship that he had not experienced on a day-to-day basis. I think it's very important for him, and so all of that together hopefully provides that safety and helps him to begin to learn and to be able to navigate his fears in a way that doesn't disrupt his behavior, because he is at risk of that behavior deteriorating.